Get out. Now. The officer's voice echoed through the dimly lit bar, cutting through the low hum of conversations and clinking glasses. Heads turned, and silence fell like a heavy curtain. A man, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, froze mid-sip of his drink. He blinked, his eyes darting to the uniformed officers pushing through the crowd toward him. "Sir, we're asking you to leave the premises immediately," the officer barked, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Excuse me." The man's voice was calm, steady, but there was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "Don't play dumb. I said out. Now." The second officer stepped closer, towering over him. "We don't want any trouble here. You don't belong in a place like this." The man placed his glass down slowly, his jaw tightening. "I don't belong. And what exactly do you mean by that?" The first officer smirked. "Let me spell it out for you. We've had complaints about a suspicious-looking man hanging around here. Fancy suit, expensive watch, doesn't fit the crowd. And now that I'm looking at you, yeah, you definitely don't fit." The words hit like a slap, sharp and intentional. The man's shoulders squared. "I'm here for a drink. That's all. Not anymore." The second officer grabbed his arm, yanking him to his feet. "Let's go." The man stiffened, pulling his arm back. "Take your hands off me." That's when it escalated. The first officer shoved him hard against the bar, his voice booming. "Who the hell do you think you're talking to? Do you know how fast we can make you disappear? You think that suit means something? Out here, you're just another punk who's asking for trouble." The crowd began to murmur, but no one stepped in. Faces turned away. Some pulled out phones, recording from a distance but unwilling to speak up. "I haven't done anything wrong," the man said through clenched teeth, his voice shaking, not with fear, but with restraint. "And I don't care. You're leaving, or you're going to jail tonight. It's your call." Handcuffs snapped around his wrists before he could even respond. The officers pushed him toward the exit, dragging him through the bar as whispers rippled through the room. "You'll regret this," the man said, his voice low but carrying weight. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The first officer laughed. "Oh, I doubt that. You'll learn to stay in your place." Outside, the cool night air hit hard, but the man's blood was boiling. Cameras flashed, capturing his humiliation as the officers forced him into the back of a patrol car. "Search him," one officer barked. "Wallet, keys, what's this?" The second officer pulled out a badge. A gold badge. He squinted at it before his face twisted in disbelief. "You're kidding me." "What? What is it?" The first officer snatched the badge, reading the title engraved on it. His face drained of color. "Oh, hell no," he muttered, shoving it back into the man's pocket as if it burned to the touch. But it was too late. The damage was done. The words were already out there, hanging in the air like smoke. FBI Director. And as the man sat in the back of the car, his wrists still bound, his eyes held no fear. Only fire. Because what those officers didn't realize, what no one in that bar knew, was that their lives were about to change forever. But how far would he go to prove his point? And just how deep did the corruption inside that department really run? At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all forms. This channel is a safe space for stories that challenge prejudice and highlight the importance of equality and respect. To every Black viewer watching, know that your voice matters, your experiences matter, and you are seen. We are committed to sharing stories that empower and inspire change. Thank you for being here. Sit back, enjoy this powerful story, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more impactful narratives. Now, let's dive in. The bar was one of those places that seemed to exist outside of time, dimly lit, with walls stained from decades of cigarette smoke and secrets whispered over cheap whiskey. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted outsiders, especially not someone like Malcolm Reed. He didn't belong there, and he knew it. But he had his reasons. Malcolm sat at the far end of the bar, his tailored charcoal suit looking almost out of place among the worn leather jackets and faded jeans surrounding him. He stirred his drink absent-mindedly, eyes scanning the room without seeming to focus. He was good at that, blending in just enough to go unnoticed, but sharp enough to catch everything. Years of practice had taught him that skill. Malcolm was a man used to control. At 43, he had built his life around it, measured steps, calculated risks, and an unshakable presence that commanded respect. Raised in the rougher neighborhoods of Detroit, he'd seen firsthand what happened to people who let their guard down, who trusted too easily or spoke too freely. He learned early how to read people, how to measure their intentions before they even opened their mouths. That instinct had carried him through law school, through the academy, and eventually, to the top of the FBI. But tonight, sitting in that bar, he wasn't Malcolm Reed, director of the FBI. He was just a man trying to disappear for a few hours. The whiskey burned as he swallowed, but it wasn't enough to dull the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had spent the last 3 weeks buried in reports of corruption, officers abusing their badges, bending the law until it broke, and walking away clean. It was the kind of rot he had dedicated his career to cutting out. And yet, it always seemed to find new ways to spread. That night, Malcolm wasn't there to drink. He was there to think. The bar's door swung open, and the low murmur of conversation stilled for just a moment. Malcolm didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in energy, the sudden heaviness in the air. The footsteps that followed were deliberate, heavy with purpose. 2 men. Officer Jake Callahan led the way. He had the build of someone who spent more time lifting weights than doing paperwork, broad shoulders, thick arms, and a jaw perpetually set in a scowl. He wasn't from this precinct, but Malcolm had heard the name before. Callahan had a reputation for pushing limits, and not in a good way. Behind him, Officer Ryan Blake trailed like a shadow. Younger, leaner, but with the same hard edge in his eyes. Malcolm felt them before he saw them, their presence pressing in as they approached. He kept his expression neutral, even as Callahan leaned in closer. "Evening," Callahan said, his voice carrying more authority than courtesy. Malcolm glanced up, taking his time. "Evening." Callahan's eyes swept over him, landing on the watch peeking out from under his cuff. "Nice suit. Nice watch too. Bit fancy for a place like this, don't you think?" Malcolm set his glass down. "Didn't know there was a dress code." Blake smirked, but Callahan didn't. Instead, he took a step closer, crowding Malcolm's space. "We've had some complaints. Someone matching your description's been causing trouble around here." Malcolm arched an eyebrow. "Causing trouble? How, exactly?" "Why don't you stand up and we'll discuss it outside," Callahan said, his hand drifting toward his holster. Blake flanked him, eyes locked like a predator sizing up prey. Malcolm didn't move. "I'm not leaving my drink," Malcolm said, keeping his voice level. Callahan's jaw tightened. "I wasn't asking." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Malcolm could feel the eyes of the room on him, but no one spoke. No one moved. Blake reached out, grabbing Malcolm's arm. That's when the shift happened. Malcolm stood, sudden and deliberate, pulling his arm free with practiced ease. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut. Callahan was on him in an instant, shoving him hard against the bar. "You don't get to talk to me like that. Not here. Not ever." Malcolm felt the wood dig into his ribs, but he didn't fight. Not yet. He could feel the weight of the badge in his pocket, but now wasn't the time to play that card. Instead, he let them think they had one. Blake yanked his arms behind his back, snapping the cuffs tight. Malcolm didn't flinch. "You'll regret this," Malcolm said, his voice low but steady. Callahan smirked. "Doubt it." Outside, the night air hit like a slap, cold and sharp. Malcolm's pulse was steady, his mind already running through scenarios. Cameras were rolling, he could see the flashes and hear the murmurs, but the officers didn't care. They pushed him into the back of the squad car without hesitation. Malcolm didn't speak as they drove, the streets blurring past. He let them feel in control, let them believe they had the upper hand. But inside, the fire was already burning. He knew their names now. He knew their faces. And soon, they'd know exactly who he was. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the man they humiliated wasn't just another stranger in a bar. He was the man who could dismantle their entire lives with a single phone call. And he was just getting started. The squad car crept through the dimly lit streets, its tires humming softly against the asphalt. The red and blue lights reflected off the windows of closed storefronts and flickered across the empty sidewalks, but inside the car, the atmosphere felt far heavier than the night outside. Malcolm sat stiffly in the back seat, his wrists aching from the cold bite of the metal cuffs that were still locked tightly around them. His eyes stayed focused on the streets rushing past, but his thoughts weren't on the route they were taking. They weren't on the city or the flickering neon lights in the distance. No, Malcolm's focus was on the two men sitting in the front seats, their laughter low and mean as they exchanged quiet words between themselves. They thought this was funny. They thought they had won. Jake Callahan glanced up at the rearview mirror, catching Malcolm's reflection, and his lips curled into a smirk. The kind of smirk that came from someone who believed they had all the power in the room, someone who thought control was a birthright rather than something that had to be earned. "You're awful quiet back there," Callahan said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just starting to realize you should have kept your mouth shut when you had the chance." Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. Years of training and discipline had taught him how to keep his emotions locked away when it mattered most. Instead, he kept his gaze on the darkened streets outside, letting the officer's words roll past him like distant noise. He could feel the weight of the badge in his pocket, the one they hadn't bothered to check. He wanted to pull it out right then and there, to drop it in their laps like a grenade and watch them scramble to recover, but not yet. Not here. Timing was everything, and Malcolm knew how to wait. Ryan Blake, the younger of the two officers, turned in his seat, the glow from the dashboard casting sharp shadows across his face. His grin was sharp and mean, the kind of smile that said he was enjoying every second of this. "You know, it's funny," Blake said, his voice practically dripping with condescension. "Guys like you always think you're untouchable. Walking around like you own the damn world. But not tonight. Tonight, you're just another nobody who pushed his luck." Malcolm's eyes locked onto Blake's, steady and unflinching. He let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the tension build before speaking. "Enjoy this moment," he said finally, his voice low but heavy, each word cutting through the air like a knife. "Because it won't last." Blake let out a sharp laugh, glancing at Callahan. "You hear that? He still thinks he's somebody." Callahan chuckled, his smirk widening as he slapped the steering wheel for emphasis. "Let him think whatever he wants. Doesn't matter. By the time we're done with him, he'll be begging for someone to bail him out." The car slowed as they turned down a narrow street, pulling into a small parking lot beside an aging precinct building. The station looked worn and tired, its walls stained with years of grime and neglect. It wasn't a place designed for justice, it was a place where things got swept under the rug. Malcolm stepped out when the door opened, his back straight despite the tight cuffs and the rough hands guiding him forward. The station was quiet, only a few officers lingering near their desks. They barely glanced up as Callahan and Blake marched Malcolm through the hallways and into a small, windowless holding room. The walls were gray and featureless, and the only furniture was a metal table and 2 chairs. Blake shoved Malcolm into the chair, the metal legs screeching against the floor. Blake leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while Callahan began to pace slowly around the room like a predator circling its prey. "So," Callahan began, his voice low and deliberate. "Why don't you go ahead and tell us who you really are? You've been awfully quiet about that so far." Malcolm met his gaze without flinching. "You didn't ask." Callahan's eyes narrowed, and then he slammed his palms down on the table, making it rattle. "Don't play games with me," he snapped, leaning closer. "We can do this the easy way, or we can make this a whole lot harder for you." Malcolm leaned back slightly, his face still calm despite the tension in the room. "You don't want to do this," he said evenly, his voice steady and controlled. Blake smirked from the corner. "Oh, I think we do." Callahan stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Here's the thing. Nobody cares what happens to you. Nobody's coming to help you. So whatever fantasy you've got playing in your head about how this ends, let it go. It's just you and us now." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. Instead, he leaned forward just enough to make Callahan pause. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "No one's coming to help me." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before adding, "But someone's coming for you." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. For the first time, Callahan hesitated. It was brief, just a flicker of doubt, but Malcolm saw it. He saw the cracks beginning to form. Blake shifted slightly, his confidence faltering, but Callahan straightened his shoulders. Big words for someone in cuffs. Malcolm smiled faintly, and for the first time that night, it wasn't forced. It was the smile of a man who knew something they didn't. "Enjoy your shift," he said, sitting back in the chair. "It's going to be a long night." Callahan's face hardened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed Blake's arm and pulled him out of the room, slamming the door behind them. Outside the precinct, the city was quiet, but Malcolm's phone, still hidden in his pocket, was already sending out signals. Somewhere across town, systems were lighting up with alerts, drawing attention to a man who had suddenly gone dark. Screens were flashing. Protocols were activating. The pieces were already moving. Back in the holding room, Malcolm sat in silence, his pulse steady as footsteps echoed down the hall. He didn't flinch as the door opened and another officer stepped in, a clipboard in hand. The man glanced at Malcolm, hesitated, and then stepped back out. In the hallway, Malcolm could hear hushed voices, the tension rising. He could see it in their faces when Callahan and Blake came back into the room, the cracks widening, the panic starting to creep in. And Malcolm knew. The tables were already starting to turn. The question wasn't if they would break, it was when. The sharp knock on the metal door broke the uneasy silence that had settled in the room. Malcolm didn't move. He sat perfectly still in the hard, uncomfortable chair, his eyes fixed on the scuffed tabletop. The air felt heavy, thick with tension that was almost suffocating. The door creaked open, and Malcolm finally looked up, his expression unreadable as Jake Callahan stepped inside, his face tight and drawn in a way that hadn't been there before. Behind him, Ryan Blake followed, but this time, the arrogance that had defined him earlier seemed to have dimmed. Callahan pulled out the chair across from Malcolm and sank into it, the legs screeching against the floor. He didn't speak right away. He just stared, as if trying to read something that wasn't written on Malcolm's face. Blake hovered near the wall, his arms crossed tightly, but his restless movements betrayed the nerves simmering just beneath the surface. Malcolm's voice broke the silence first. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Callahan's jaw tensed, but he forced a smirk. "You think this is funny? You think this is some kind of game?" Malcolm leaned back slightly, his hands still cuffed in front of him, but his posture as composed as ever. "No. I think you're starting to realize you've made a mistake." Callahan leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the table. You're not in control here. You think that badge in your pocket changes anything? It doesn't. You don't intimidate me. Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. I don't need to intimidate you. Not yet. Blake stepped forward then, his voice sharper than before. Enough with the cryptic crap. We already know who you are. So what? You think that gets you a free pass? Malcolm turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Blake. Who I am doesn't get me a free pass. It gets me something much worse for you. Blake flinched, just barely, but Callahan jumped back in before the moment could settle. You're bluffing. You think flashing that title around is going to scare us? Nobody's going to believe you. Not after tonight. Malcolm's lips curved just slightly, the kind of smile that didn't need to be explained. You think this is still about tonight? His voice dropped, slow and deliberate. It's not. It's about every night before this one. Every stop you made. Every person you cornered. Every lie you told to cover your tracks. Callahan's face darkened. You don't know what you're talking about. Malcolm didn't blink. Don't I? I've been watching this precinct for weeks. Do you think your little games weren't already on my radar? Do you think the complaints were ignored? No, Callahan. They were being documented. Every report. Every incident. Every time you thought nobody was paying attention. Blake stepped back, his face paling. You're lying. Am I? Malcolm's voice was sharp now, cutting through the air. How do you think I ended up in that bar? You think it was by accident? You think I just wandered in for a drink? No. I went there because I knew exactly what would happen. And you proved me right. Callahan's hands clenched into fists on the table, but his voice faltered. You're bluffing. If you really had something, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. We're having this conversation because I wanted you to see it unfold. I wanted you to feel it. Blake's voice cracked. Feel what? Malcolm's eyes locked onto his. What it feels like to be powerless. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. The tension wasn't simmering anymore, it was boiling. Callahan's eyes darted toward the door, but it remained closed. Locked. Malcolm's gaze followed his. You're not leaving this room until I say so. Callahan snapped. You can't hold us here. You don't have that authority. Malcolm leaned forward. You're right. I don't have to hold you here. But I can keep you here long enough for what's coming next. As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Callahan's head whipped toward the door just as it opened. Two men in suits stepped inside, no uniforms, no badges visible, but their presence alone sent a ripple through the air. One of them nodded toward Malcolm without saying a word, and Malcolm finally stood, his movements calm but deliberate. Blake's voice cracked. What the hell is this? Malcolm didn't even look at him. He turned to Callahan instead. This is where the story changes. This is where you learn what consequences feel like. Callahan pushed back from the table, but one of the men in suits stepped forward, blocking his path. You don't get to walk out of here, Malcolm said, his voice steady but sharp. Not after what you did. Not after what you've been doing. Blake's voice rose in desperation. You can't do this. You're setting us up. This isn't legal. Malcolm's eyes locked onto him. Illegal? You think I don't know what illegal looks like? I've seen the files. The videos. The reports you tried to bury. But you didn't bury them deep enough. Callahan's voice was hoarse now. We didn't, stop. Malcolm cut him off, his voice slicing through the chaos. You don't get to talk your way out of this. Not this time. Blake backed against the wall, but Malcolm wasn't looking at him anymore. He turned back to Callahan, stepping closer until their eyes were level. "Remember what you said to me earlier? That nobody was coming to help me? That nobody cared what happened?" Malcolm's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "You were wrong." The sound of more footsteps filled the hallway outside, louder this time, heavier. Callahan's face drained of color as the door opened again and more agents stepped inside. Malcolm stepped back, his voice calm but final. "You asked me who I am," he said, his gaze steady. "Now you're about to find out." The pounding of footsteps outside the door sent a tremor through the small, windowless room, but Malcolm didn't move. He remained seated, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the dull surface of the metal table. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with the weight of everything unsaid, of everything that had already happened and everything that was about to unfold. The tension seemed to stretch and twist around the walls, pressing in closer with every second that passed. The door finally creaked open, and Malcolm looked up slowly, his expression controlled, unreadable. Jake Callahan stepped inside first, his movements slower this time, more deliberate, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, uncertainty. It was faint, buried beneath the surface, but it was there. Ryan Blake followed closely behind, but the cocky energy that had surrounded him earlier was gone now. His shoulders were tighter, his steps less confident. He stood near the door, his arms crossed, but Malcolm could see the nervous way his fingers twitched against his sleeves. Callahan dropped into the chair across from Malcolm, letting the legs scrape harshly against the floor as he leaned forward, trying to reclaim control. Blake stayed near the wall, close enough to observe but far enough to keep some distance, as though Malcolm's presence might burn if he got too close. Malcolm waited, letting the silence stretch. He could see the frustration building behind Callahan's eyes, the way his jaw tightened and his fists curled on the table. But Malcolm didn't speak. Not yet. He wanted them to sit in it, to feel it. It was Callahan who finally broke the silence. "You think this is over?" His voice was sharp, but Malcolm caught the faint tremor buried in it. "You think you're walking out of here with your head held high? You think any of this ends the way you're imagining?" Malcolm leaned back slightly, the metal of the handcuffs glinting under the dim light as he adjusted his wrists. "I don't think anything," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "I know." Callahan's smirk faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Malcolm saw it. He saw the cracks spreading, the first hints of panic starting to show. "You don't know a damn thing," Callahan snapped, his voice louder now, more desperate. "You sit in your office, behind your desk, and you think you understand what it's like out there. You think you know what it takes to keep people in line. You don't know anything about the real world." Malcolm's eyes didn't leave his. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to hide behind a badge. I don't know what it's like to abuse the authority that comes with it. But I do know what it's like to answer for your choices. And now, so will you." Blake stepped forward suddenly, his voice cracking as the words spilled out. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We didn't mean for it to get this far. We were just—" He stopped himself, his eyes darting to Callahan like he was searching for permission to keep going. Callahan shot him a look sharp enough to cut. "Don't." But Blake's voice wavered again. "We weren't trying to hurt anyone. We were just keeping things under control." Malcolm's gaze shifted to him, and his voice came out low but razor-sharp. "Control? Is that what you call it? Dragging people out of their cars? Pinning them against walls? Humiliating them just because you could? You don't get to call that control. You don't get to dress it up with excuses. It was abuse, plain and simple, and now you're scared because you finally have to answer for it." Blake's hands were trembling now, and he took a step back, but Malcolm wasn't done. He turned to Callahan, his eyes burning with a quiet fire. "You think this is about one night? You think this is about what happened in that bar? It's not. It's about everything that led up to it. Every stop. Every arrest. Every time you pushed someone down because you thought nobody was watching. But I was. I was watching. And so was everyone else. Callahan's fist slammed down on the table so hard it made Malcolm's cuffs rattle. You're not better than us. Don't stand there acting like you haven't crossed lines. You're just like the rest of us, playing the game to win. The only difference is you get to hide behind your title. Malcolm leaned forward now, his voice sharp and cutting. I don't need to hide. Not from you. And this isn't a game. It never was. But you played it like it was, and now you're losing. So don't sit there and act like this is something being done to you. You did this to yourself. Blake's voice cracked again, this time higher, more desperate. What happens to us now? Malcolm didn't answer. He let the question hang in the air just long enough for the silence to make it worse. The door opened again, and this time, the men who entered didn't wear uniforms. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Callahan's head snapped up, and his eyes darted to Malcolm like he was waiting for an explanation, but Malcolm just stood, calm and deliberate. One of the men in suits stepped forward. Stand up. Callahan didn't move at first. You can't do this, he hissed through gritted teeth. You don't get to just destroy our lives because of one mistake. Malcolm's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. One mistake. This isn't about one mistake. It's about all of them. Everyone you thought you'd never have to answer for. Blake stumbled forward, holding out his hands. Please, just listen, but Malcolm cut him off, his voice firm. No. I've listened enough. The agents stepped closer, their hands moving to the cuffs on their belts, and Callahan finally stood, his movements stiff and reluctant. You wanted this, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper now. You wanted to see us fall. Malcolm's gaze stayed steady. No. I wanted you to see it. And as Callahan and Blake were led out of the room, their footsteps echoing down the hall, Malcolm remained where he was, his shoulders squared, his breathing steady. The weight of everything lingered in the air, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He had waited for this moment. He had planned for it. And as the door closed behind them, he knew the story wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The door slammed shut behind Callahan and Blake, and the echo lingered in the room longer than it should have. Malcolm stood still, his hands resting on the edge of the metal table, his fingers pressing lightly against the surface as if grounding himself after everything that had just unfolded. The room felt heavier now, but not because of fear or tension. It was the weight of certainty. The weight of finality. The men who had walked out of that door moments ago were not the same men who had walked in. They weren't officers anymore. They weren't in control anymore. And Malcolm knew that realization was beginning to sink in with every step they took down that hallway. The two agents in suits lingered near the door, their movements deliberate but patient, like men who had seen situations like this unfold countless times before. One of them finally spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the silence without shattering it. We'll process them now. Paperwork's already started. Internal Affairs wants interviews by morning. He paused, glancing at Malcolm. Do you want in on the first round? Malcolm shook his head, his voice calm but firm. No. Not yet. Let them sit with it for a while. Let them feel what it's like to wait for the hammer to drop. He stepped back from the table, his shoulders straight, but the tension in his jaw gave away what was still simmering beneath the surface. I'll see them when they're ready to talk, and when I'm ready to listen. The agent nodded, then stepped out, leaving Malcolm alone again. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder now, almost invasive, but Malcolm didn't move. His mind was still processing the events of the last few hours, replaying every word, every glance, every flicker of fear he'd seen in their eyes. He knew what came next. Investigations. Hearings. Statements. Reports. It wouldn't end tonight. It wouldn't end tomorrow. But the first domino had fallen, and there was no stopping the chain reaction now. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the badge they had ignored earlier. The metal felt cool and solid against his fingers as he turned it over, the engraving catching the light. Director of the FBI. The title carried weight, but tonight, it felt heavier than ever. He had spent years building a reputation that couldn't be questioned, creating an image that demanded respect. But tonight had reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time, what it was like to be powerless, even if only for a moment. It wasn't the handcuffs or the rough hands pushing him against a wall that lingered in his memory. It was the feeling of being seen as less, as other, as undeserving. And for all his power, all his influence, that feeling still cut deep. The door opened again, this time without the sharp knock that had announced the others. It was Agent Ramirez, one of the people Malcolm trusted most on his team. She stepped inside, her eyes sharp but sympathetic, carrying a folder thick with documents. She set it down on the table without a word, then leaned back against the wall, studying him carefully before speaking. They're processing the arrests now. Media's already sniffing around. It won't stay quiet for long. Malcolm exhaled slowly, nodding. Let them talk. It's better that way. Ramirez crossed her arms. You sure about that? Because once this hits the headlines, there's no putting it back in the box. This isn't just about two bad cops. It's about what they represent, and what you represent. People are going to pick sides, and not all of them are going to be in your corner. Malcolm met her eyes, his voice steady. I didn't do this to make friends. I did it to make a point. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. And you did. Loud and clear. She paused, her voice softening slightly. But you should know, there's already chatter. People asking if this was personal. If you went after them because of what happened to you in that bar. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. It wasn't personal. It was professional. But if they can't tell the difference, that's their problem, not mine. Ramirez didn't argue, but her silence said enough. Malcolm knew how this worked. The moment people felt threatened, they looked for ways to discredit the threat. They'd twist the story, rewrite it to fit their own narrative. He had prepared for that. But now that it was starting, he could feel the weight of it pressing in. He turned to Ramirez. I need their records. Full history. Complaints, disciplinary actions, everything. And I want it ready by morning. She nodded. Already started. But Malcolm, her voice trailed off, hesitation flickering across her face. What? She hesitated again before continuing. One of the officers, Blake, he's already asking for a deal. Says he's willing to talk if we go easy on him. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. About what? Ramirez shrugged. We don't know yet. But he's nervous. Says there's more, stuff we haven't found yet. Malcolm's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. Get him talking. Find out what he knows. Ramirez turned to leave, but stopped at the door. And Callahan? Malcolm's voice hardened. Let him sweat. He's not ready to break yet. But he will be. When the door closed, Malcolm sat back down at the table, his thoughts racing. Blake's willingness to talk changed things. It meant there was more, something bigger, something darker than what had already come to light. And if Malcolm was right, it wasn't just about two corrupt officers anymore. It was about the system that let them operate unchecked. His phone buzzed, and he pulled it out, scanning the message on the screen. Media requests were already piling up. Questions. Demands for statements. Opinions flooding social media. He could see the storm forming, growing stronger by the minute. But Malcolm wasn't afraid of storms. He had weathered plenty before, and he would weather this one too. Still, as he sat in that cold, windowless room, he couldn't shake the thought that this was far from over. The arrests were just the beginning. The consequences were still unfolding, and the deeper he dug, the more he wondered what else might be buried beneath the surface. And as much as he wanted to believe that justice had already started, a part of him couldn't help but wonder how far he was willing to go to make sure it didn't stop. Malcolm stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the interrogation room, his back against the cold wall as he stared at the small window set into the door. Through the glass, he could see Ryan Blake sitting alone, his hands fidgeting on the table, his shoulders hunched forward as though the weight of the cuffs around his wrists was finally starting to sink in. Blake's eyes kept darting toward the door, and every few seconds, he glanced at the mirror on the opposite wall, probably wondering whether someone was watching him. He was unraveling, and Malcolm could see it happening in real time. Agent Ramirez stepped up beside him, her voice low but steady. "He's ready to talk. He's scared. Keeps saying he didn't know it would come to this. Keeps trying to pin everything on Callahan, but he's not making much sense yet." She paused, studying Malcolm's face carefully before continuing. "You sure you want to handle this personally? I can take the lead if you need time to step back." Malcolm shook his head, his eyes never leaving Blake. "No. I need to hear it from him. I need to see his face when he says it." Ramirez nodded, but there was hesitation in her voice. "Just be careful. He's panicking, but that doesn't mean he's clean. Don't let him play you." Malcolm's voice was low but sharp. "He doesn't get to play me. Not now." She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped aside as Malcolm pushed the door open, letting it close behind him with a sharp click that made Blake flinch. The younger man looked up quickly, his eyes wide and red-rimmed, the panic almost visible in the tightness of his movements. Malcolm didn't say anything at first. He let the silence settle, let Blake feel the pressure of his presence before he slowly pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Blake spoke first, his voice shaky and too fast. "I'll talk. I already told them I'd talk. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't think it was going to go this far." "I didn't mean," Malcolm cut him off, his voice calm but heavy. "Stop. Take a breath and start from the beginning. No excuses. Just the truth." Blake swallowed hard, nodding as he wiped the sweat from his palms against his pants. "It was Callahan. He said we needed to send a message. That if we let people start pushing back, we'd lose control. He said we had to keep things tight, keep people in line, or the whole precinct would fall apart. He made it sound like we were protecting the neighborhood, like we were the last line holding everything together." Malcolm's eyes stayed locked on Blake's, but his voice stayed steady. "And you believed him?" Blake nodded quickly. "Yeah, I did. I mean, it made sense at first. People didn't listen unless we showed them who was in charge. And Callahan, he knew how to get respect. People were scared of him, but they listened. And when it started working, it felt like we were doing the right thing. Like we were keeping people safe." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. "And when did it stop being about safety? When did it start being about power?" Blake froze, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Finally, he looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. It just happened. It was little things at first, pulling people over for no reason, making them sit in their cars while we searched them. Then it turned into planting things, messing with evidence, roughing people up just enough to scare them but not enough to leave marks. And by the time I realized it had gone too far, it was already too late. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop him." Malcolm's voice dropped, sharp and deliberate. "You didn't even try." Blake's head snapped up, his eyes desperate. "I couldn't. You don't get it. He had everyone in his pocket, other officers, supervisors, people higher up. If I'd said anything, he would have buried me. You think I didn't want to stop it? I did, but I didn't know how. Malcolm's stare hardened. So instead, you kept following orders. You let him set the rules, and you followed them because it was easier than standing up and risking your career. Blake's voice cracked. It wasn't just my career, it was my life. You don't understand what it's like to feel trapped like that, to know that if you make one wrong move, you'll lose everything. Malcolm's voice was sharp. I understand more than you think. But you didn't lose everything. They did, the people you stopped, the people you humiliated, the people who didn't have the power to fight back. You had a choice, and you chose yourself. Blake looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he dropped his head, his shoulders slumping as if the last bit of fight had finally drained out of him. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I just wanted it to stop. I thought if I kept my head down long enough, it would all blow over, but it never did. It just kept getting worse. Malcolm leaned back, letting the words sink in. He could feel the weight of them, the desperation and guilt tangled together, but he didn't let it soften him. Not yet. Tell me about the others, Malcolm said finally, his voice low but firm. Blake hesitated, but then the words started pouring out, names, dates, incidents that hadn't been in the files yet. Each one hit like a blow, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He took it all in, memorizing every detail, every loose thread he would need to pull later. When Blake finally stopped talking, he looked up at Malcolm with eyes that were raw and pleading. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything, but I need protection. Callahan, he's not going to go down quietly. He'll come after me, and you know it. Malcolm's expression didn't change. You'll get protection. But don't mistake that for forgiveness. You're not a victim, Blake. You're a coward. And no matter how much you talk, that doesn't change. Blake's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Malcolm saw it, the full weight of the consequences settling over him. The fear. The regret. The realization that there was no undoing what had already been done. Malcolm stood, pushing his chair back as he turned toward the door. We're done here, he said, his voice cold and final. Blake's voice broke as Malcolm stepped into the hallway. What happens now? Malcolm didn't look back. Now you deal with the fallout. And as the door closed behind him, Malcolm exhaled, the weight of everything pressing against him as he prepared for what came next. Malcolm stood in the hallway, his back against the wall, his breath steady despite the storm still raging inside him. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, but his focus remained on the voices filtering through the door of the interrogation room. Blake was still inside, his muffled words spilling out to Ramirez and the agents as he unraveled piece by piece. Malcolm didn't need to hear the specifics, he already knew the framework of what was being said. The panic in Blake's voice had already given away the most important truth. He was willing to trade everything to save himself, and Malcolm wasn't sure yet whether that disgusted him or if it gave him hope that the house of cards was finally collapsing. The sound of heavy footsteps snapped Malcolm out of his thoughts. He looked up to see another agent approaching, his expression sharp and controlled, but there was something in his eyes that hinted at urgency. He stopped just short of Malcolm, leaning in slightly as he lowered his voice. Callahan's asking to talk. He says he has something you need to hear, but he'll only tell you directly. Malcolm didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, his hands flexing slightly at his sides before he straightened his shoulders. Where is he? Interrogation room 2. He's been sitting there for the last hour, quiet, hasn't said a word until now. But he looks different, like he's already made peace with whatever comes next. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Without another word, he pushed off the wall and started down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the tile. The walk felt longer than it should have, the weight of what waited behind the door pressing heavier with every step. When he reached it, he paused just for a moment, his hand resting on the handle as if testing its weight, before pushing it open. Callahan was already sitting at the table, his wrists cuffed in front of him, his posture slouched but not broken. His eyes lifted when Malcolm entered, and for the first time, the anger that had burned so fiercely in them before was gone. What replaced it wasn't fear, it was resignation. Malcolm closed the door behind him and crossed the room slowly, taking the seat across from Callahan without a word. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Callahan finally spoke. "You got what you wanted," he said, his voice lower than Malcolm had ever heard it. "You tore it all down. Everything I built. Everything I protected. And for what? So you could make an example out of me?" Malcolm's voice was sharp but calm. "I didn't tear anything down. You did that yourself. All I did was shine a light on it." Callahan's jaw tightened, but there was no fire in his response, only exhaustion. "You think it's that simple? You think this is black and white? It's not. It never was." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto Callahan's. "Then explain it to me. Explain how this was supposed to be anything but what it is. Corruption. Abuse. Power twisted into something it was never meant to be. Tell me how I'm supposed to see it any other way." Callahan exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair as he ran his hands through his hair. "You don't get it. You never will. You sit up there in your office, behind your title, and you look down at the rest of us like we're supposed to be perfect. But out here, perfect doesn't work. Perfect gets you killed. You think I liked doing what I did? You think I enjoyed it? I didn't. But it worked." Malcolm's voice hardened. "It worked for you. It worked for Blake. It worked for the ones who thought the rules didn't apply to them. But it didn't work for the people you left bleeding in the street. It didn't work for the people who were too scared to call for help because they knew you'd show up." Callahan slammed his hands down on the table, the cuffs clinking against the metal. "And what about the ones we did help? The ones who were safe because we kept the streets clean? You don't hear their stories, do you? You don't see the ones who made it home at night because we were willing to do what you're too afraid to do?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "You don't get to hide behind that excuse. Not anymore. You didn't clean the streets. You poisoned them. You didn't protect people. You terrorized them. And now you're sitting here, trying to convince me that it was justified. That it was necessary. But it wasn't. And you know it." Callahan's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Malcolm saw the cracks spreading wider, the weight of everything finally breaking through the wall he had built around himself. His voice dropped, quieter but no less raw. "You want me to say I regret it? Fine. I regret it. I regret all of it. But regret doesn't fix anything. It doesn't erase what's been done." Malcolm leaned back slightly, his voice steady. "No, it doesn't. But it's a start." Callahan's eyes lifted, something flickering behind them, hope, maybe, or desperation. "What happens now?" Malcolm didn't look away. "That's up to you. You can keep pretending this was all about survival, or you can own it. You can tell the truth about what happened here, about what you did, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find a way to make something right." Callahan swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. "And if I don't?" Malcolm's expression didn't waver. "Then you'll watch it all collapse around you. And you'll know you had the chance to stop it and chose not to." The silence that followed was thick, but this time it felt different. It felt final. Callahan nodded slowly, his shoulders sinking further as the fight drained out of him completely. Malcolm stood, pushing his chair back as he turned toward the door, but Callahan's voice stopped him. "Why me?" Malcolm turned back, his voice calm but sharp. "Because you made it easy. You thought you were untouchable. And now the world gets to see what happens when you're wrong." And with that, Malcolm stepped out of the room, leaving Callahan alone with the weight of his choices. Malcolm walked down the dimly lit corridor, his footsteps echoing against the cold tile floors as the weight of the last conversation still lingered in his chest. The air felt heavier now, like the walls themselves were pressing inward, carrying the tension of every word that had been spoken in that room. He passed closed doors and empty desks, but his focus never wavered. His mind replayed Callahan's words, the cracks in his voice, the rawness that had bled through when the mask of confidence finally fell away. There was something unsettling about it, not because Callahan had shown remorse but because it had taken so long for it to surface, buried beneath layers of excuses and self-preservation. When Malcolm turned the corner, he saw Ramirez waiting at the end of the hall, leaning against the wall with a folder clutched in her hands. Her eyes met his as he approached, and he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tapped against the edge of the folder like she was holding back something she wasn't sure he was ready to hear. She straightened when he stopped in front of her, her voice low but sharp. "We've got more problems." Malcolm's voice was calm but firm. "What is it?" Ramirez hesitated, flipping the folder open and holding it out to him. "It's Blake. He's talking, too much. He's naming names, giving up details we didn't even know to look for. Internal Affairs is already on it, but the scope of this," she shook her head. "It's bigger than we thought. He's implicating supervisors, other officers, people who've been here for years. And if what he's saying is true, this precinct isn't just compromised. It's rotten to the core." Malcolm scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing as he took in the names and accusations spilling across the documents. The weight in his chest tightened, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he closed the folder and handed it back to Ramirez, his voice steady. "Follow the leads. Cross-check everything. I want confirmations before this goes any further." Ramirez nodded, but her eyes didn't leave his. "You know what this means, don't you? It doesn't stop with Callahan and Blake. This is going to ripple through the entire department, maybe even further. Once this gets out, it's not just their reputations on the line, it's ours too." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice didn't waver. "Good. Let it ripple. Let them all feel it." Ramirez exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. "And what about Blake? He's pushing for immunity, says he won't testify without it." Malcolm's eyes darkened. "He doesn't get immunity. Not after what he's done. He can talk all he wants, but he's going to face consequences just like the rest of them." Ramirez nodded but didn't move. She hesitated for a moment longer before speaking again, her voice softer this time. "And Callahan?" Malcolm's gaze shifted, his expression unreadable. "He'll talk. One way or another." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, but Malcolm didn't wait for a response. He turned and started down the hall again, his footsteps steady as he pushed past the weight pressing down on him. The doors at the end of the corridor opened into a larger room, a space filled with desks, phones ringing, and the low hum of conversations. Heads turned when Malcolm walked in, but he ignored the stares, the murmurs that followed him as he crossed the room. He could feel the tension hanging over the precinct like a storm waiting to break, but he didn't slow down. At his desk, his phone buzzed, and he picked it up without hesitation. The voice on the other end was sharp and direct. "We need to talk. Now." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm listening. It's worse than we thought. We're pulling more files, but the patterns match what Blake's been saying. This wasn't just Callahan. It's systemic. Promotions, transfers, it's all connected. And if we don't act fast, we're going to lose control of this before we even get it out the door." Malcolm's voice was sharp. "Then don't let it get out the door. Lock it down. No leaks. No statements. Not until we have everything in place." The voice hesitated. "And what about the media? They're already circling." Malcolm's tone hardened. "Let them circle. When we're ready, we'll give them something they can't ignore." He hung up the phone, his mind racing as he leaned back in his chair. The walls felt closer now, the hum of conversations sharper, but Malcolm didn't move. He stared down at the files spread across his desk, the names and faces staring back at him, and he felt the weight of it pressing heavier against his chest. He had spent years building this, building trust, building order, and now it felt like it was crumbling beneath him. Ramirez approached again, her voice softer this time. "You okay?" Malcolm didn't look up. "I don't know. Ask me when this is over." She didn't push. Instead, she set another folder down in front of him. "They're ready for you in the conference room. Press wants a statement." Malcolm stood, his movements slower now, more deliberate as he straightened his tie and grabbed the folder. Ramirez followed him down the hall, her footsteps lighter but no less steady. When they reached the double doors of the conference room, Malcolm paused, his hand on the handle as he exhaled slowly. Ramirez's voice was soft. "You don't have to carry this alone, you know." Malcolm looked at her, his voice steady but quiet. "Yes, I do." And with that, he pushed the doors open, stepping into the room filled with reporters, cameras flashing, and voices rising. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate as he moved to the podium, the weight of the moment settling over him like a second skin. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "What I'm about to say will not be easy to hear, but it needs to be said. The events of the past several days have revealed systemic failures within this department, failures that cannot and will not be ignored. This is not just about the actions of a few individuals. This is about a culture that allowed those actions to thrive. And that culture ends now." The cameras clicked, the reporters scribbled, but Malcolm didn't stop. He kept speaking, his voice steady, his words deliberate, as he laid out the steps that would follow, the investigations, the terminations, the prosecutions. He didn't flinch, didn't soften the truth, because the weight of it demanded to be felt. And as he stepped back from the podium, the room erupted with questions, voices calling out his name, but Malcolm didn't stop to answer. He turned and walked out, his shoulders straight, his eyes sharp, knowing that the hardest part was still to come. Malcolm sat alone in his office, the faint hum of the city filtering through the window behind him. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls, but he didn't mind the darkness. It felt appropriate, like the remnants of the storm he had spent weeks navigating were still lingering, refusing to dissipate entirely. His desk was covered in papers, files, transcripts, signed orders, but his eyes weren't focused on any of them. Instead, they rested on the small, framed photograph tucked in the corner of his desk. It was an old picture, one taken years ago when he was still a young agent, standing proudly in front of the academy with his classmates. Back then, the world had felt so much clearer, so much simpler. But now, after everything that had unfolded, Malcolm wasn't sure if clarity was something he'd ever truly have again. The knock at the door was soft but deliberate, pulling Malcolm out of his thoughts. He didn't look up right away. "Come in." Ramirez stepped inside, her expression unreadable as she closed the door behind her. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice quieter than usual. "It's done. Callahan pled guilty. Full confession. He didn't even ask for a deal. Just told the judge everything and let them take him away." Malcolm's fingers tapped lightly against the desk as he processed her words. "And Blake?" She sighed, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Testified against the others, just like he promised. But he's not walking away clean. Plea deal's in place, but he'll do time. Not as much as Callahan, but enough." Malcolm nodded, but his expression didn't change. "And the rest?" Ramirez shifted slightly, her voice tightening. "Half the precinct's either suspended, fired, or under investigation. It's going to take months, maybe longer, before it's rebuilt. But it's happening. The cleanup's already started." Malcolm finally looked up, his eyes sharp. Good. Make sure it keeps moving forward. No excuses. No delays. She studied him for a moment, then softened. And what about you? You going to take a breath now? Or are you just going to keep grinding until you burn out? Malcolm allowed himself the faintest smile, but it didn't linger. I'll breathe when it's finished. Ramirez shook her head, but there was admiration in her voice. It is finished, Malcolm. At least this part. You did what you set out to do. Now let it rest. Malcolm didn't answer right away, but he nodded slightly, his eyes drifting back to the photo on his desk. He could still feel the weight of it all, the decisions, the fallout, the faces of the people who had trusted him to make it right. But for the first time in weeks, that weight didn't feel suffocating. It felt manageable. When Ramirez left, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the city lights outside. He thought about Callahan, sitting alone in a cell, replaying every decision that had led him there. He thought about Blake, who had broken under the pressure but at least had the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. And he thought about himself, about the road that had brought him here, about the nights he had spent questioning whether he was any better than the men he was trying to take down. But as he stared out at the city, Malcolm knew he had made the right choices, even when they were the hardest ones to make. He had stood his ground. He had refused to back down, even when the odds were stacked against him. And now, the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. The corruption had been exposed. The system was beginning to heal. And Malcolm could walk away knowing he had done his part to make it happen. The reflection of his badge caught his eye, and Malcolm reached out, running his fingers over the cool metal. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place, and why he couldn't stop now. There would always be another battle to fight, another fire to put out. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Malcolm allowed himself to feel something close to victory. This story is more than just a tale about justice. It's about power, how it's used, how it's abused, and what happens when the people who are supposed to protect us forget what their badges stand for. It's about choices, about how one wrong decision can spiral into something far worse, and how even those who think they're untouchable can fall. But most importantly, it's about accountability. It's about having the courage to face the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's painful. Think about what happened to Callahan and Blake. They thought they could hide behind their badges, that the system would protect them no matter what they did. But the truth always comes out. And when it does, it demands answers. It demands justice. And think about Malcolm, the man who refused to look the other way, even when it would have been easier. The man who stood up, not just for himself, but for everyone who couldn't. We all have moments in our lives where we have to choose between what's right and what's easy. So ask yourself, what would you do? Would you stand up? Or would you stay silent? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you think about the choices these characters made and whether justice was truly served. And if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, Tales of Twist, for more stories that challenge and inspire. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.